I was thinking about 90 the other day, and for some reason I started thinking of Dr. Spock, the author of Every Parent's Bible. But as for my behavior, one thing I do remember was a conversation I overheard between my mother and father. Mother was a worrier. She loved to worry, and she had a lively imagination to provide her with things to worry about. Considering that it was time of the Depression, this was rather something of a reach, I thought, but I heard her saying, what would happen if I had been kidnapped and held for ransom? What I do remember is my father's immediate response, which was, within 48 hours, they would probably be paying us to give him back. I was talking about Ed Thompson, the genius editor of Life magazine. He had a phrase that he used frequently, not just with me, saying, guess what you just volunteered to do? In 1952, Harry Truman was just finishing his term as president. The Republican convention had just nominated Dwight Eisenhower for the presidency, and the Democrats, Adlai Stevenson. Ed Thompson had the brilliant idea that we'd have a debate in Life with President Truman writing about why you should vote for Stevenson, and Bob Taft, a senator from Ohio, writing about why you should vote for Eisenhower. And my boss called me and said, explained this and said, we're having this debate, and Taft says he'll do it if he has an amanuensis. Guess what you've just volunteered to do? I said, I can't believe this, because Bob Taft was on line to be the nominee of the Republican Party, and the reason he was pushed aside by Eisenhower was a bunch of liberal Republicans led by Harry Luce of Time Inc., who talked Eisenhower into writing and put Taft out. Why would Taft possibly write for Life magazine? Ed said, I don't know, but he says he will if he has some help. So I presented myself to Senator Taft's office in Cincinnati, Ohio on a Sunday, because Taft was leaving for what they called Taft country to campaign for Dwight Eisenhower. I got to the office on a Sunday. The office was full. All the people were there except Taft. He didn't show up, and he didn't show up. And finally, one of his associates said, this is Bernie, I can't understand it. He's always on time. Taft arrived another half hour, I'd say, and he said, I'm sorry for the delay. I decided before taking this trip that I'd have a full physical examination, and I've given 100% okay, so here we go. 7 months later, he was dead of cancer. In those days, at that particular time, we had no idea that Adlai Stevenson would be such a poor campaigner. He was a great governor, and he probably would have been a good president, but he was a terrible campaigner. If Bob Taft had been nominated instead of Eisenhower, it's quite possible that he would have won with a very large Midwest vote. He would have died in July after his inauguration. And of course, my question always was, who was his vice president? Who would then be president of the United States? And it was 2 or 3 years later that we found out from Eisenhower that Taft's selection for vice president, had he been nominated, was Douglas MacArthur. Douglas MacArthur would have been president of the United States. And everybody groaned until I remembered another time I'd been told, guess what you've just volunteered to do? This was about, this was a little later that this happened, when MacArthur promised President Truman that the Chinese would not interfere in the war in Korea if the American and UN troops, led by American troops, marched all the way to the Yalu, the north one, across the 38th parallel. MacArthur, of course, had pulled off this fantastic runaround by getting up behind the Japanese I'll think of where it was. Anyway, on they marched, and the Chinese did come in, and the Korean War went on for another year or more, all sorts of, lots of slaughter, and MacArthur started making noises about using the bomb against the Chinese, against China, and Truman fired him. At that point, Harry Luce sent a cable to MacArthur saying, whenever you want to tell your side of this story, the pages of Life magazine are open to you. It was maybe a couple of years later that a man came into Luce's office with a tome that thick and left it on Luce's desk and said, "This is General MacArthur's story." Luce said, "Yeah, wait a minute. I said when General MacArthur wants to tell his story, pages are open to him. And this is by you, Major General Courtney Whitney, who was MacArthur's chief aide at the time." Courtney Whitney said, "The general says that he will never write his memoirs." And Luce said, "Well, we want to get that in writing." And so General MacArthur, of all people, wrote a note saying, "A man would be too vain to do his own autobiography." MacArthur, of all people. Anyway, Luce looked at it, Ted Thompson looked at it. It was nothing more than an assemblage of memos and speeches by MacArthur with hardly any connective tissue. It was just a bunch of stuff. But it was decided that if we would rewrite it under the supervision of General Whitney, we would go ahead. And Thompson called me and said, "Guess what you've just volunteered to do?" Well, I had just bought this house here on the water, and I said, "I can do it if I don't have to come to the office, if I can do it at my new house." And Thompson said, "Of course, I don't want you in the office because there'll be too many other things bothering." So I sat here for 6 months and rewrote this book with a battery of researchers in New York coming up with new material. I dictated it. It was sent into New York. It was typed by a typist, sent back for me for okay, sent to the checkers for okay, sent to Thompson and Luce for okay, and then went over to Courtney Whitney, who sent every chapter back with very few changes. Amazing. This was a totally different book, and yet very few changes. A little pencil thing, all in penciled handwriting. About that time, General MacArthur became 75 years old, and I used the time and expense account to buy him a couple of bottles of very expensive brandy, which elicited a first note I ever had from him, a handwritten note: "Dear Whipple, thank you very much. I appreciate it so much, and I shall enjoy it," and so on and so on. And I thought, I'll keep this, and I had another look at it and compared it to the manuscript I had beside me. General MacArthur was editing this book, not Courtney Whitney. And I realized then that this was the way he was doing his book with Courtney Whitney. And on we went through the whole book until we got to the Korean War, and the big question always was, why did MacArthur promise Harry Truman, the president, that he knew the Chinese would not come into the war? And MacArthur never explained it. Truman had never explained it. It seemed so obvious that they would. So I, in effect, almost made it up and said that the general decided that if the Chinese came into the war, we would attack China with all the means at our disposal, including the atomic bomb. And he came back okayed by him. So that was the end. Ever thereafter, MacArthur used that as his reason for promising Truman. And later on, when Harry Truman wrote his memoirs for Life magazine, Truman said, "I always wondered why the stupid son of a bitch made that promise, but so he thought we'd use the bomb. Well, I'm glad I fired him." One other aspect of this I thought was fascinating was that in the course of this book, of course, we had to explain the whole business of the occupation of Japan by MacArthur, who was our go-lighter and who was in charge of everything, the supreme commander of everything, and who insisted on writing the new Japanese constitution. So here's the man who might have succeeded Bob Taft as President of the United States, and the man whom everybody would regard probably as the most reactionary president we could possibly have had he become president, and yet the Japanese constitution, written by MacArthur and his aides, insisted that the women have the vote for the first time in Japan, insisted that labor unions be protected, insisted that the Communist Party be on the ballot if they wished to be on the ballot, Here's the Constitution by the man who's supposed to be the most reactionary person. I was talking to George Harnick, an old friend of mine the other year, about a year or so ago, about this, and said it was always puzzling to me that the Japanese Constitution was so liberal when it was written by MacArthur and his aides, and George said, who had spent many years in Japan, said it was all those liberal lawyers that Franklin D. Roosevelt sent out there who wrote that Constitution. I do remember MacArthur telling me that when the Constitution was all written and translated into Japanese, he said, I did a double take and said, I want to see it translated from the Japanese into the English, back into the English. He said there were a lot of things that weren't exactly what we wanted. It suffered in translation. We had to be sure and get it back. Whitney had one other anecdote about that Constitution, which specified that Japan would get rid of its military forces and would never go to war. In those days, and even these days, the idea of a country for forsaking any kind of military action ever was almost unheard of. But MacArthur insisted on it, and it went through. Whitney said that he was in charge of dealing with the Japanese Prime Minister, whose name I've now forgotten, at the time that this Constitution was going through. And he reported to the big general, as he called MacArthur, that he was having a very hard time on that particular item. Understandably, here's a couple of generals, they could understand why the Japanese didn't want to forsake an army and all kinds of, any military troops at all. And MacArthur said, when are you meeting him next? And Whitney said, on Wednesday at 2 p.m. MacArthur said, just tell him again that we insist on it, and I think it'll be all right. And Whitney once said, I walked away shaking my head, wondering why, but all right, I hadn't been all right when all the meetings we'd had before. However, at exactly 2 p.m., I brought the matter up again, and just as the Prime Minister was about to complain, I heard a drone, and a big B-29 flew right over the building. It wasn't the B-29 that had dropped the bomb, but it was a B-29 that dropped the bomb, and that B-29 flew right over the building, and the Prime Minister said, all right, we'll accept it.